Hi, welcome to the first Pavilion Talk of DAC 2020. I'm Wally Rhines, and I'm here to give an update on where the EDA industry is, where our customers are, and where we're headed. This has been a pretty unique period for EDA and semiconductor history. COVID-19 has caused worldwide economic impacts, as well as changing the way we work. But despite all that, employment has remained very strong for designers, for electrical engineers, for software developers. By the Department of Commerce definition, we're at full employment. In fact, better than full employment, and it's still difficult to hire good people in our field. Now, our customers are experiencing one of their modest busts in the boom-bust cycles that occur and have for many, many years. Fortunately, there are more booms than busts, but 2019 was a down year for the semiconductor industry. And if you look at the revenue trend, that 11% decline was caused mostly by memory pricing rather than logic. Logic actually grew in terms of a piece of the semiconductor industry, and that's where the EDA industry gets the majority of its revenue. Well, what about 2020? Afraid it doesn't look very good. After negative 11% last year, the analysts in October had a consensus around a 7% growth this year. But if you look at their current forecast, it's down to zero growth, with some as low as minus 12% for Handel-Jones at IBS, and others coming down, still probably haven't hit bottom. Well, the EDA industry enjoys the benefit that semiconductor research and development tends to be pretty stable over time. There are periods, like 2008, when people didn't know if the recession was ever going to end, and so we took a hit in semiconductor R&D. But in general, semiconductor companies know that the recessions will be over. COVID-19 will be over. We'll get a vaccine or a cure or something, and they'll need new products. So they continue to maintain their staffs and develop products during a recession. And when there's a downturn in R&D spending, it's usually very mild. After all, the industry has spent 14% of revenue for the last 35 years with only modest deviations, enforcing their confidence that things will get better and improve, else they wouldn't spend 14% of their revenue on R&D. Well, we have other positives. Semiconductor capacity is increasing. 10 new wafer fabs to come online in 2020. That's a lot. And as semiconductor wafer capacity comes online, sometimes it causes pricing pressure, which is actually good for the fabless companies who are buying wafers. But over the long term, it's simply a signal that revenue will grow. After all, throughout the history of our industry, over 60 years, the semiconductor revenue per unit area has been relatively constant, even back to germanium. And so when you see the semiconductor area increasing through capacity, it's indicative that semiconductor revenue will increase as well. And there's another ratio, sort of interesting. The EDA revenue for our industry has been 2% of semiconductor revenue for the last 25 years, and that's remained fairly constant as well. So when the semiconductor industry grows, it's good for EDA. Now, there are some markets that aren't so good, I believe, going forward. One of them is the automotive market and the associated manufacturing industries, robotics, other fields like that. They're under pressure due to the COVID recession. For the automotive market, it looks to me like a bubble waiting to burst. Why do I say that? Well, after all, the automotive percent of semiconductor revenue has been growing, the fastest growing of any category, and now is 9% of semiconductor revenue, and the forecasts are for it to go closer to 10% in the future. Why wouldn't that happen? Well, one reason is there are over 500 companies that have announced that they'll introduce electric cars or light trucks. There are also 277 companies that have announced autonomous drive programs. Does the world need over 500 companies developing these products? And what about the current decrease in automotive unit sales, down 22% versus last year at this time? There are probably going to be some cuts in R&D. There are going to be some companies that don't make it. In terms of autonomous drive, probably some decrease in development of multi-passenger autonomous vehicles, although the investment in autonomous delivery vehicles could well continue. Overall, you'll see some of those Chinese companies drop out of the electric car race, but we're still seeing an enormous number of companies that are performing electronic design for this evolution of autonomous drive and electric vehicles. That's caused a big boom for EDA, one that's probably going to take a breather. Well, positive markets include computer servers, PCs, and video games. They all remain pretty strong. Looking at the worldwide global revenue for servers, it took a step up in 2017 and then a big step up in 2018 to $88 billion, and pretty well held that in 2019. And we're off to a start saying it can be held through 2020 as well, based upon the first quarter results. Even areas like wireless handsets, which have been declining in unit volume, are holding their semiconductor revenue relatively constant because of the growth of semiconductor content in 5G phones. There may be a modest decrease, but not a big one for the semiconductor industry, and even the unit volumes are slowing their decline as 5G becomes popular. How about China? Big issue for semiconductors, since over half of all semiconductors in the world are purchased by China. And you may think that's in order to insert them into end products that are shipped back to the United States, but that's becoming less true all the time. Almost half of the China consumption of semiconductors is going into products manufactured in China for sale domestically in China. So the China market is very important for the U.S. semiconductor industry. Well, what about China's production of its own semiconductors? And the equipment businesses that are being built on semiconductor technology. China took a big hit in areas like PC units and other electronics in December when COVID hit, but bounced back very strongly, even above the previous level in all but the cellular phone category. And the semiconductors for those? Well, only 19% of China's need for semiconductors is produced in China. Well, that's changing. Over the last 10 years, it's almost doubled from what it was. And if you look at the worldwide semiconductor capacity by region, China is growing rapidly. Korea is also growing, and Taiwan is growing a little. China is already at the same level as the United States and is likely to become substantially greater. But what about trade restrictions and its effect on our industry? Now, when ZTE was almost put out of business due to its violation of the Iran embargo, it was a Sputnik moment for China. They realized that dependence on the U.S. for semiconductors was really a risky prospect. So they started an enormous program of subsidies, $20 billion initially in 2014, and matched by 5-1 by the private equity industry in China. A really good strategy because private equity invested money in enterprises that can become profitable and grow, eliminating any sort of political agenda in the subsidies. Additional subsidies have occurred in 2019 of about the same size, and there'll presumably be some match there too, now targeting a bigger share, not in manufacturing, but in design, even EDA tools, and other infrastructure needs. Well, China's initiative has accelerated the number of fabless companies dramatically, and they took off in 2015 and 2016. And if you look at the initial public offerings for semiconductor companies in China, 2019 was more than double the total value of the previous 5 years combined, a big acceleration in the semiconductor industry in China. And the fabless companies in China have been growing in size as well. If you go back to 2006, the number of Chinese fabless companies that had more than 500 employees was less than half of 1%. Go to 2015, and that number is over 6%. The number in 2006 of Chinese fabless companies that had between 100 and 500 employees was less than 10%. By 2015, it was 43%. Well, export regulations are going to be a challenge for the semiconductor industry. The Department of Commerce now is granting validated licenses for a host of different products going to China. For me, this is deja vu all over again. In 1980, I became chair of the Technical Advisory Committee of the Department of Commerce, overseeing semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. At that time, the U.S. had 76% market share in semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and Japan only 19%. But Japan was very efficient at granting those validated licenses and only took a few days, plus or minus a couple days, in order to grant a license. The U.S. was not so efficient. It took 2 weeks, and that could be plus or minus 2 years. And as a result, companies found they couldn't depend upon U.S. suppliers if they needed to get a spare part, which required a separate validated license, or even a user manual. Bill Bottoms coined the term vendor of last resort at that time because the U.S. was less reliable in shipping products. Now, there were other factors, but the U.S. market share clearly came down, and by 1990, 10 years later, was about the same as Japan, 45%. Was the same thing going to happen with semiconductors? I certainly hope not, but it's a risk. Fabless company IC sales in China are increasing dramatically. This is worldwide fabless sales, and the U.S., which was at 69% in 2010, has dropped modestly to 64%, while China has tripled from 5% to 15%. The U.S. government is exerting its muscle. TSMC is now forced to stop selling directly to HiSilicon subsidiary of Huawei, as well as Huawei itself. It's a big hit. 73% of TSMC's revenue in China went to Huawei or HiSilicon in 2019. And if you look worldwide, it was also $5 billion of sales last year, a significant customer, only modestly behind Apple. Well, the effect on TSMC's other Chinese customers may be significant. And while there is a fab commitment in the U.S. to come on in 2024, it's a small part of TSMC's total capacity. So I don't think U.S. fabless semiconductor companies will be depending upon U.S.-based production very significantly anytime soon. But I think the bigger challenge for our industry is how do you develop leading-edge competitive products if you can't deal directly with the leaders in end-equipment businesses, like in 5G communications? That's a challenge we're going to have to overcome. Now, the U.S. is helping out. $23 billion bill on the table to increase U.S. manufacturing capacity, to invest in research and development, create jobs, support the semiconductor industry. We'll see how that goes and how much help it provides for the industry. Now, the U.S. has dominated the creation of new semiconductor companies throughout most of the history of the industry. Looking back to 2012, that blue you see on the chart is the U.S. Most of the startups in the world started in the U.S. But in 2017, that changed. Now, most of the startups are in China. And the question for the future in the U.S. is, will startups still initiate in the U.S. knowing that they may not be able to sell to over half of the worldwide semiconductor market, or will they start in other countries where they can address the entire semiconductor market worldwide? That's likely to be a challenge to the U.S. as the creator of semiconductor companies. Now, how is EDA holding up in all this COVID chaos and the trade disagreements? Actually, the answer is it's holding up really well. And so did Synopsys. Ansys did well too, and Siemens, Mentor, although they don't disclose their detailed results, announced at their analyst meeting last year that Mentor grew much faster than the overall EDA industry. Well, 7% growth for EDA is a really good level if you look back historically, because typically we grow about a point greater than the semiconductor industry. And some might say, well, we've had the benefit of the growth of the IP business, but indeed, IP is growing at about the same rate now as licensing, maintenance, and other services. What's remarkable is that printed circuit board software is leading the way in license and maintenance revenue and has become number one in the major categories, partly due to all the system design companies who have joined the game of designing their own electronics. Now, the EDA strength, I think, is influenced mostly by the increased investment in systems companies, or by systems companies doing their own designs, and IT companies as well as a very vigorous move to leading edge and very difficult technologies at 7, 5, 4, and 3 nanometers. TSMC gets over a third of its revenue from 7 nanometers and below, a big impact of leading edge technology. And if we look at the EDA industry in general, we find it's growing 3 points faster than the semiconductor industry, 7% versus 4%. That's not normal. And that, I think, is coming from the IT and systems companies predominantly. If you go back 10 years, systems companies, the Apples and automotive companies and others, were not buying very many wafers directly. But that's changed. Over the last 10 years, they've grown their share of the wafer purchases in the world by 35% compounded and are now almost 20% of all the wafer purchases in the world. The fabless companies have declined as a percent, and in many cases, they've lost that business to the systems companies going direct. Companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Alibaba, as well as automotive, tier ones like Bosch, and many more are now leading edge customers spending a great deal on EDA software for IC design as well as printed circuit board design. Apple announced that it's doing its own silicon processor chip for the Mac. They're already doing their application processors for the iPhone, and they've begun working on baseband through purchase of the Intel baseband design business for wireless, increasingly controlling their destiny through semiconductor design. Tesla, I think, surprised the world with the confidence they demonstrated in a really outstanding autopilot system chip tailored for the Tesla Automotive autonomous drive applications. And we have other companies doing their own AI chips, despite the wealth of AI chips coming to the market from independent startups. Well, the net result of all this is the semiconductor content of systems is increasing. We've had 25 years where semiconductor content in systems was about 16% of the total value of those systems. And that has jumped to 20% in recent years. That's a big increase. That's a big help for the semiconductor industry. And that's a reflection of the increased value added that semiconductors provide. Now, application-specific architectures have been on a wave of growth, and new companies have been coming to market all the time. But COVID is slowing that down. If we look at the venture capital funding of fabless companies, it set a record in year 2000 at $2.5 billion. And then it declined almost continuously for the next 15 years until it stepped up in 2017 at $1.5 billion, and then a new record at $3.5 billion in 2018, $1 billion higher than the previous record. and a good following year around $2 billion. This year, we're off to a slow start as those VCs have to prioritize their existing investments, and so they put a slowdown on any new investments. But during that period, from 2012 to 2019, we had $2.7 billion invested in fabless startups, and that's created a wide range of new non-von Neumann architectures for new applications. Mostly, they went to machine learning. And machine learning, while a growth area for semiconductors and compute, is also benefiting the EDA industry. Consider some of the products introduced by Cadence to optimize physical design and a variety of other functions, and Synopsys as well in all sorts of timing analysis and other tools, and of course Mentor on the verification side and simulation side. All these companies are benefiting from what machine learning can provide in giving better results, reducing the time, the amount of simulation that has to be done, and reducing the cost per simulation. A big impact on the industry. Well, let me close with just highlighting a few emerging challenges that are exciting to me. One, obvious to everyone, is packaging. We've had in the last few years a tremendous growth in fan-out wafer-level packaging, use of interposers, 2.5D, 3D, and that's causing a lot of disruptive change and a lot of innovation. If you just look at the silicon that's used for interposers and packaging, it's growing rapidly, and we see the emergence of more and more use of silicon in 2.5D and 3D packages. And we're seeing a really interesting new technology in chiplets. Now you can get menus of modular chips, and companies like AMD and Intel are developing derivatives of their designs in a very efficient fashion using chiplets and easing the verification process and shortening the time to market. Well, I'd like to talk about one other that's near and dear to me, and that's a mega change. The fact that data is becoming the new oil. That is, the value of data is apparent to everyone who looks at Google and Facebook and other companies. But right now, most people who own data can't easily use it for profitable purposes because they end up disclosing it. It's hard to keep it secure and resell it to many other people. Well, that's going to change. Fully homomorphic encryption is coming to market in the not too distant future. What it does is let the client encrypt its data, send it to the cloud, and all forms of arithmetic and logical processing can be performed on that data without ever decrypting it, and it's sent back to the client in still encrypted form. And with that encryption, you can build a neural network model that goes through machine learning using encrypted data. The model stays encrypted, and the queries can be encrypted. So you can create a business in a trusted environment because the server center isn't trusted, but the data is protected anyway. This whole era will lead to privacy computing. And whereas in the past you had to either bring the data to the algorithm or the algorithm to the data, both of which involve trusting someone, with fully homomorphic encryption, you don't have to do that. One minor limitation, however, the compute for fully homomorphic encryption requires about 1 million times faster servers than what's available with the best of Xeon or NVIDIA servers today. So we've got a challenge. It's a design challenge. It's a semiconductor challenge, but it's going to happen a lot faster than you think. Let me summarize. The modest revenue loss in the semiconductor industry is not causing much of a decrease in R&D, and hopefully won't in the future, and that gives stability to our industry. Work from home works for designers. It works for EDA developers. That's a little tough for hardware acceleration and on-site services, but in general, our industry remains pretty healthy. A growth of system companies participating in the world of electronic design, printed circuit boards, and especially integrated circuits is driving in new customers and new revenue to our industry. VC-funded AI startups, while they've slowed this year, have created a host of new chips and will require a lot of additional chip designs and derivatives. And finally, fully homomorphic encryption will usher in a new era of value for data. It's going to be exciting. EDA continues to be a great place to be, both business-wise and innovation-wise. My thanks for joining me today. Have a great day.